Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning.
Woo!
It's as a consequence of free speech and the ability to speak that people can put their finger on problems, articulate what those problems are, solve them, and come to a consensus. Woo! And we risk losing that.
That is University of Toronto professor Jordan Peterson. Why is he speaking about liberty on the campuses? It's election day here in America, and yet I believe that my guest from Canada can give us a strong warning on this election day. I'm not associating him with any candidate or party in America. We want to talk issues. This is The Line of Fire. You're listening to Michael Brown. These are issues we have talked about for years. These are issues we have warned about for years. And with all respect for the personhood of everyone who identifies as LGBT and as a follower of Jesus, as one who would affirm Jesus died for straight, gay, exactly the same way, I have said for years, those who came out of the closet want to put us in the closet. We have warned about these very things, and you need to hear from Canada today, and then we'll make application in the United States. Professor Peterson, thanks so much for joining us on The Line of Fire.
Hi, good to talk with you.
Could you please give us the background to what happened in Canada and what has put you now in the middle of this very intense firestorm?
Well, I received some correspondence from a couple of my clients. I'm a clinical psychologist, pointing out I've had a number of people in my clinical practice who'd been, I would say, harassed by politically correct types into a state of mental distress. And a couple of them sent me some material about a month ago. One sent me the decision of the University of Toronto Human Resources and Equity Vice President to make anti-racism and anti-bias training mandatory for the human resources staff. And the other was a notification of a federal bill in Canada called Bill C-16, which purports to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected categories under the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code, making discrimination on the basis of those two things into hate speech. And I went on to the Ontario Human Rights Commission website to look at the policy documentation surrounding similar legislation that had already been passed at a provincial state equivalent level in Canada. And the more I read, the more the hair stood up on the back of my neck, I would say. So the first problem is that the legislation is the first law, I would say, that I know of in Canadian history that mandates that a certain type of language must be used. So it's government-mandated language. And so I first saw that as a tremendous imposition on freedom of speech. And the second is that the preferred pronoun issue, which is the right of anyone who has a, let's say, non-standard identity to require of anyone who interacts with them that they use a certain form of address. It could be they as a singular representation, or some of the made-up words for non-binary gender types like Z or Zer. There's a whole slew of them.
Yep.
And that really also irritated me and distressed me, because I regard those artificially constructed words as language constructed by the left-wing authoritarians, roughly speaking. And I know a lot about left-wing authoritarianism, having studied it for 3 or 4 decades.
I tell you what, I need to jump in. We've got a break. I want to unpack this. Friends, call a friend, tell them to tune in. What's happening in Canada is happening in America as well.
My real objection to what's happened to American higher education is that it has replaced intellectual humility with dogma. No longer do these people graduate realizing that they know even less than they thought when they started college, and that their whole life, that everything that happens to them in the next 70 years or however long they're alive is going to be a process of learning even more stuff. And they just try to go through life consuming as much as possible. They instead graduate now thinking they know how the world works. And that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do, to educate what is now, almost 3 generations of kids that they know how the world works. Like, they've got it down, And what this produces is this generation of angry, embittered victims that believe in grievance and victimhood and oppression ideology. And that's all it is. It's just ideology.
That is the voice of Milo Yiannopoulos, himself a conservative gay activist, if you could imagine that. He was in an interview with Canadian Stéphane Molyneux in Freedom Domain Radio just yesterday. I'm on the line now with Professor Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto. Sir, you said that your background is in clinical psychology?
That's right, yeah.
All right, so what do you make of the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and then where we've gone as a culture that if I want to be identified, even though I'm a biological male, as she or they or Zer or Her Majesty, that not only is it etiquette to do it, but you are required to do it. First, the diagnosis of it, and then what's being required of you as a university professor.
Well, the gender dysphoria diagnosis is usually applied to someone who feels uncomfortable with the designation that would be applied to that person as a consequence of their biological sex. So the typical gender dysphoric, maybe the classic case, is a child who, for some reason or other, insists that they're a he if they're born a she, or they're a she if they're born a he. Now, the clinical literature basically suggests that with children who are manifesting that sort of behavior, if they're left alone, roughly speaking, about 80% of them determine at some point before they reach adulthood that they're gay, but 90% of them settle into their biological gender identity. And so there was a psychiatrist up here named Ken Zucker, Dr.
Yes.
Ken Zucker. He ran the dysphoria clinic. Yeah, it's quite a famous case.
Got shut down, didn't he?
Yeah, they shut him down. And I mean, all Ken did, Ken's a pretty apolitical guy. I would say he's just a scientist and a clinician, not politically active in any way. His basic advice was, look, if you have a child that's manifesting gender dysphoria, the best thing to do is just wait and see. Don't bring out the knives and the hormones too soon. But, they shut him down, fired him. He's suing the CAMH, which is a big mental hospital up here, and the Toronto Star, I believe, and also the Varsity newspaper at the University of Toronto, I think, for defamation of character. So, they're going after the psychiatrists pretty hard, and they're going to go after the evolutionary biologists and the evolutionary psychologists next. It's going to be pretty funny, the people that you're talking to. I know that, generally speaking, evangelical Christians and evolutionary biologists aren't necessarily the best of friends, but It looks like pretty soon you guys are going to be in the same boat, so that's a pretty interesting twist of fate.
Yeah, so I want to come to this left-wing authoritarianism in a moment. But, sir, you're a professor and a clinical psychologist. So you meet a biological male, visibly, obviously a biological male, 20 years old, and now he says that he wants to be identified as she or they. As a clinical psychologist, what would you say to that person just in terms of counsel to them? And then how do you respond professionally when you're required to identify them a certain way?
Well, it would depend on the context. I mean, if it was a casual meeting, my response to that, I thought that through in quite a bit of detail, is that as far as I'm concerned, you have no right to determine what nomenclature I'm forced to use to address you. If you want to interact with me, then I'm going to do that in the manner of my choosing, and I don't see that you have any right to control my language, to mark yourself out as special in any particular manner, especially not if it's compelled. The thing about the legislation, too, is that it's very incoherent. So the legislation basically states explicitly that gender identity, which is your felt sense of being a male or female, is nothing but subjective feeling. And also your gender expression is basically your fashion choices, and it's also a choice. It's a choice that's unmoored from the underlying biology. And so I'm being asked to call someone I'm being asked to allow someone to forcefully regulate the speech patterns that I use to address them on the basis of nothing but their subjective choice. And I don't regard that as acceptable, and I don't think it's a matter of courtesy to do it. I think it's a matter of deep discourtesy bordering on tyranny to demand it, especially if it's backed up with legislative force. Now, lawyers up here have been claiming that I'm exaggerating the dangers of this bill, but I can tell you the University of Toronto doesn't seem to agree, because they sent me 2 letters of warning telling me to stop saying that I won't use preferred pronouns. And I know perfectly well that they did that after consulting their legal teams, looking at my video, deciding that my interpretation of the nature of this legislation is in fact correct, and also noting that as my employer under this legislation, they're as liable for my speech acts as I am. So, and from a clinical perspective, that's more complicated. I deal with people who have identity issues very, very frequently, and basically what I do with people like that is let them talk it out. Because if you're deeply confused about your identity, and there's very few, what would you call, indications of deeper confusion than confusion about gender, you need to articulate yourself. You could think about it as a necessity to rely on your inner logos, if you'd like. You have to articulate yourself over many, many hours, maybe hundreds of hours, in order to talk through what you mean by identity, what function it serves, how you're going to take your place in the world, what problems that's going to cause you, and so forth. So the clinical context would be an entirely different, kettle of fish.
Got it. I've written a bunch of articles on this in my book, A Queer Thing Happened to America, which came out in 2011. I have a chapter called Big Brother is Watching and He Really Is Gay. And I cite examples from America, but from Canada, with other professors who've gotten in hot water over similar issues or taking exception to, because of their religious beliefs or conservative values, redefining of marriage and things like that. So examples from Canada, England, and Australia, as well as the States. And in certain ways, Canada has been a bit more aggressive in certain of these things, and there may be less pushback because of the nature of the church there. I wrote an article called Fee Fi Fo Fum, I Smell the Marks of Trans Activism, and I go through kind of the scorecard of all the different identities that you have to use, theoretically. And I point to earlier this year, a teacher in an Oregon elementary school who identified as transmasculine was awarded $60,000 by her school district because other professors wouldn't refer to her as they. So when you're talking about the authoritarianism, the confusion, and the identity issues, let's just go one step deeper on identity, and then we'll return to your specific case. We've got about 2 minutes before the break here. Don't people have identity issues in many, many other ways, not just with sexuality, that are more tied to reality?
Well, that's another of the complicating factors. I mean, one complicating factor, of course, is outright delusions, and they usually fall under the realm of psychotic episodes, very serious forms of mental disorder. But then there are other issues that are more closely aligned with the issue of, say, gender identity or gender dysmorphia, like anorexia. And anorexics, of course, believe that they're fat, and that they're aimed very hard at often a state of emaciation that's not commensurate with life. And there are lots of chat rooms online that are pro-anorexia, where the anorexics basically claim that any attempt to treat them psychiatrically or medically is a violation of their fundamental identity. And I think their claim is as valid as the claim of the people who... It's as valid as anyone else's claim.
Exactly. What about
the boundary?
Yeah. What about BIID? Right, body identity integrity disorder. Same thing, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, and there's also, I don't know if you know about this. Your readers or your listeners will probably be thrilled to hear about otherkins.
Yes, of course. Document that as well. Yes,
that's right.
Animal identity, right?
Yeah, and non-human, like non-human, and yeah. Well, and the thing is if you decide that identity is nothing but subjective choice, which is actually what's written right into this legislation.
Yes.
Then, as far as I can tell, there are no boundaries whatsoever on what a demanded identity might be. And you see that in the explosion of the number of gender identity categories.
Exactly.
And you probably know that New York City already protects 31 different gender identities.
And $250,000 fine if you don't go along with it. I signed an exit survey poll today and it had gender, male, female, and then fill in the blank.
You're not only in danger as a student, you're in danger as a member of the faculty too. There's a guy at NYU who's just been shoved out, because he has the wrong opinions on things. I mean, this is if you have the wrong opinions as a professor at these places, you're at risk.
All right. I'm speaking with Professor Jordan Peterson. That is Milo Yiannopoulos. Milo is an out and proud gay man who is militantly anti-gay activist. It's an odd mix. Yes, I understand that. But he sees the ideology. He sees where it's going. And what you've got to understand is Professor Peterson is a decades-long professional in clinical psychology and as a professor at a respected university, and yet he is endangering his professional career and in certain ways his reputation and beyond by taking a stand. So I want to get Professor Peterson's take on what Milo Yiannopoulos said yesterday on Free Domain Radio. And then so we can know exactly what Professor Peterson is facing himself. I want him to explain that to each of your listeners. But let's listen to what Milo had to say, and I want to get Professor Peterson's take on it. Go ahead.
Well, what they ultimately want to do is justify physical violence as a response to ideas. That's what you see happening on college campuses in the protests. That's what you see happening when they ship these violent thugs to Trump rallies. This is people responding physically to ideas, to opinions they don't like, and this is why the left contorts language like it does, saying that students need safe spaces, and to protect students' safety, certain speakers shouldn't be on campus or whatever. There's nothing threatening students' safety, but the reason they do it is when ordinary people hear the word safety, they're like, "Oh, well, that's probably reasonable." Who would argue with that? We've got people who've got to be safe, right? But it's actually got nothing to do with safety. It's part of a project designed to break down the barriers between speech and action, and that's a really fundamental distinction. The idea that you can say, do, and think whatever you want, but as soon as you lay a hand on somebody else, then things change, is a pretty fundamental basis of how we all come to understand what's acceptable behavior and what isn't with others, right? And the left wants to be able to hit you for having the wrong opinions, which is why it's trying to muddy those distinctions, saying that my opinions about whatever it is, gays, lesbians, transgender, whatever, justify physical violence. That's the holy grail for them. That's what they want to do. And those are the ways that you can tell that this is all being done on purpose.
Professor Peterson, your take on what Milo said. He's speaking on Canadian radio.
Yeah, well, Milo's a pretty articulate guy. I mean, he's a strange person, right? He's one of those people who really doesn't fit in any category neatly. It's pretty amusing in some sense to watch a flamboyantly gay English intellectual become the darling of Republicans and Christians across the country.
Isn't it?
It's a sign of the times. But Milo is an extraordinarily articulate person. He's very, very bright, and I certainly agree with what he just said. The left is muddying the distinction between idea and act on every level simultaneously. They're basically, you see this in the new policies on sexual harassment that are being drafted on campuses across the country, and they're coming to your workplace, people, make no mistake about it, that make sexual impropriety in speech essentially equivalent to rape. And so the thing is that it works both ways, and that's what Milo is basically pointing out. Once you admit that a speech act is equivalent to violence, then it's reasonable to use violence in response to a speech act. So yeah, it's part and parcel of the ideology.
And what are you facing potentially the most simple, clearly realistic, and the worst case scenario?
God, I don't know. I mean, the university has told me that if I continue to repeat my insistence that I won't use gender-neutral pronouns, that my right, let's say, to teach in January, which is when I start teaching again, is definitely in danger. And what I'm doing, according to the Ontario Human Rights Act, is against the law. So I have no idea what the possible outcome is. One possible outcome certainly is that my teaching career at the University of Toronto is certainly in jeopardy.
And how long have you been teaching there?
The university's made it very clear, because I pushed them into a corner a week ago, and I said, look, Jonathan Haidt wrote an article, the professor, that universities have to choose between truth and social justice. Quite an influential article. It was only published a week ago. And in Canada, I've been juxtaposing freedom of expression against social justice. And the university is required by its own policies to put freedom of speech ahead of all other concerns fundamentally. So I told them that what they should do is fight on my side if I get nailed and take it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And they told me in no uncertain terms that the university would not do that. So I made a video 2 days ago, basically, and released it. I think about 80,000 people have watched it now, reading our interchange and stating that the University of Toronto has decided that when push comes to shove, they're for equity and social justice rather than for freedom of speech. And equity, by the way, for all of you who aren't familiar with the term, equity doesn't mean equality of opportunity.
Of course.
It means equality of outcome. It means equality of outcome.
Yeah, and in point of fact, those calling for tolerance tend to be the most intolerant, and diversity basically means my way or the highway, and being inclusive means exclusive of all other ideas. Sir, we just have about a minute before we're out of time. Why are you taking the stand that you're taking? And I'm sure you've received verbal threats as well.
I am not using the words of left-wing authoritarians. I know what they're like. I studied the Soviet Union for a very long time, and I know how the millions of people who died there died. I know how it started. I know how it progressed. It started with radical equity-based Marxist philosophy. It was transformed into linguistic policy and legislation, and that was immediately transformed into the murderous policies that characterized the Soviet Union. I know Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work very, very well, and there is not a chance that I'm going to speak the language that left-wing authoritarians insist on. There's nothing I would rather do less, and I mean that in the most serious possible way. So if it means my job, that's fine. If it means that they bring me in front of the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, it's like, let them do what they want. I am not saying those words.
And would you do this? We haven't even said a word about your faith or non-faith. Would you do this simply as someone who is secular, not a religious person, based on the effects on a society?
Well, look, I think the best answer to that, it's kind of a weaselly answer, but I'm going to give it anyways. I just released another video. It's on my website, Jordan Peterson Videos, and your listeners might be interested in it because I'm a psychologist, but I know a lot about Christianity, and the video I put up has a lot to do and say about Christianity. And I can't answer the question that you're asking in a simple manner. I've studied religions for a very long time, and Christianity in great depth and comparative mythology, and I have 40 hours of lectures on one of my courses online on that topic. And so to distill it into a few sentences is a mistake.
Got it.
It's too complicated. And I wish I could give you a better answer than that.
No.
I think the fundamental elements of Christian belief are accurate.
Got it.
But I think that the Christians are making a big mistake by assuming that the truth that's presented in biblical writings, for example, is equivalent philosophically to scientific truth. Because I think it's a mistake to equate the two. And I think what it does is devalue the religious truth rather than elevate it.
All right, listen, we're going to put on our Facebook page an article. I'm a left-winger, and I support Jordan Peterson. Sir, we will pray for you. I appreciate your courage. May your message get out to the world. Stand strong.